Hi everybody. In this video, I'm going to talk you through how to take a face-to-face discussion-based lesson plan and convert it according to some of the best practices out there to an asynchronous learning module on Icon. Now, this, in terms of transforming a lesson plan from one form to another, this is perhaps the biggest jump, right? Taking a format that is all about people being in the same space, discussing things at the same time, and putting it into a format that is all about allowing everyone to work at their own pace and according to their own schedules. Now, if you're like me, this could feel a little bit painful in terms of transformation because my favorite thing about being in the classroom is getting to talk to students and see their faces as they come to one realization after another, right? And you lose a lot of that when you go to asynchronous. But you'll find that you just get it in other ways. And to be honest, even if that weren't the case, in terms of online learning, the arguments in favor of asynchronous formats are lengthy and hard to argue with. Not that there aren't drawbacks, and for example, it's a lot bit harder to foster community on an asynchronous space, but I'll show you some ways to try to counteract that tendency as well. But the arguments in favor of asynchronous learning are that it is hugely more accessible to students. If they have, for example, internet problems, they can only work at certain times of day, if they're working a job, if they just for any reason have to be able to work at their own pace, whether that's due to mental health reasons or family obligations or whatever it might be. Even for students who, because of attention, hearing, sight, abilities that differ from their peers, might have trouble in a conventional classroom, asynchronous learning really is good for them, or can be if you do it well. So I'm going to show you how to make an asynchronous module that really capitalizes on all those capabilities, because really asynchronous modules take advantage of the very fact that this learning happens online, right? In a way that oftentimes a synchronous lesson plan is trying to approximate the face-to-face thing, right? And not that you can't do synchronous well, because you can. Check out the video that Ideal has about converting the same lesson plan into a synchronous Zoom lesson. But it doesn't take advantage of the medium in the same way that asynchronous learning does. All right, so the lesson plan that I'm going to walk you through is one that I teach in my classes every semester. The main goal is to get students to explore how creators use narrative techniques to send messages through stories, right? And we do start this by looking at fables, which are the most obvious arguments of the narrative world, right? Students also learn to differentiate between intended and unintended messages. So, for example, they latch on quite quickly to the idea that the intended message of Beauty and the Beast is don't judge a book by its cover, right? Affection is not dependent on appearance. But some unintended messages about how love and romance work that are potentially troubling, right? Students practice basic analysis techniques that they're going to need throughout the semester. I also do a soft introduction of ideas of how context and audience affect meaning. So, for example, most modern readers approach the story of Little Red Riding Hood and go, okay, her mom tells her not to leave the path, she leaves the path, people get eaten by wolves, right? The narrative tool of consequences is pretty clear here, right? She strays from the path and she is punished for it. This becomes a message about obedience, right? However, if we consider that for much of this story's history, it was told in a time and place where wolves were widely understood as a symbol of sexually predatory men, right? And in this case, right, the story becomes much different. The message becomes much different, right? Instead, it's a message about, perhaps a young woman's responsibility to protect her own sexual purity against temptation, right? And so the meaning changes depending on when and where it's being told. Also, the idea that audience affects meaning, right? A lot of students latch on to the pivotal moment in Finding Nemo when Nemo disobeys his father Marlin and swims out into the open ocean to touch a boat, right? And is then kidnapped by the divers who are on that boat. Now, a child watching that might go, okay, Nemo disobeys dad and is punished, right? There are consequences. Whereas a parent watching that scene might go, oh yeah, Marlin has been parenting Nemo in such a way and in such a stifling manner that Nemo's rebellion was almost inevitable, right? So for parents, the message becomes more about allowing children to have fun and some freedom, and not allowing fear of the child's safety to cause a parent to stifle their child. Okay, so the steps in this lesson, when I do it in person, we start with an interactive lecture, right? I write, what is a fable on the board? The students all kind of go, oh, I don't know. And then I say, can we think of an example? And one of them usually raises their hand and goes, tortoise and the hare, I think. And I go, yeah. And we use tortoise and the hare as a sort of example through which we figure out what a fable is and how it works, right? Then they get in small groups and they apply the fable framework to a familiar story, right? They often choose children's movies, right? Then we get back into a whole class discussion, and each group talks about what story they discussed and what messages it's sending when we think about it as a fable, right? And here's where I do my teacher work, where I am helping them take their ideas a step further and helping them notice patterns from one group's analysis to another. Then we watch this sort of funny German Christmas commercial in which this grandfatherly figure is alone in his house for Christmas year after year because his 3 children are too caught up with their own lives to come home, right? And eventually he decides to fake his own death in order to get his 3 children to come home for Christmas, right? The intended message here being family is important, the unintended message being you are able to and maybe should lie, cheat, and scare the living daylights out of your family members in order to get them to realize that family is important, right? The whole thing ends with this very heartwarming scene of them eating Christmas dinner together. No one is as mad as, frankly, I would have been in that situation. So after we watch the commercial, they get in their small groups and once again analyze the story. And then we come out into a big discussion group and talk about what messages this commercial is sending and how, yeah? Okay, so how do we take this and convert it into an asynchronous module that students can complete online? Well, there are a couple sort of guidelines that you want to follow whenever you are transforming a lesson plan in this way. The first is to chunk your content. Now, chunking is a strategy of taking big learning objectives and breaking them down into smaller parts that are more digestible. This is really important because students' attention span and sort of stamina are much shorter online than they are in in-person formats. So in the same way that you might have more trouble focusing during an hour-long Zoom meeting than you would if it was a meeting that was in person, right? Students have a harder time staying engaged for longer periods of time in online learning formats. So breaking up that content into smaller, more digestible pieces is really, really important. Another good guideline is to use smaller cohorts to create community. Now, the lesson plan was already doing this, right? We had them working in small groups in order to help them feel connected to their peers, right? And that becomes even more important in online asynchronous formats where that sense of community is even harder to come by, right? So finding ways to get them working with just 2 or 3 other classmates in order to feel connected to their peers is really important. And in the next 2 videos about actually creating the asynchronous modules, I'll talk to you about how to do that. So the other guideline to keep in mind is to create formal and informal spaces in your lesson. This might sound sort of odd at first, but remember that any community that you care to mention, whether it's a church or a club or a civic group, whatever, has both informal and formal interaction built into their community, right? Think about your classroom. You have your lesson, right? But you also have time before class when students are just chatting with each other or with you. You have that time after class where students might come up and ask questions. Even during the class, if some students are working on something and other students are already done, right? You might be chatting. And these informal moments are actually really important to a sense of community, and when you move online, it's really easy to lose them. So finding a way to create those informal and formal spaces and then maintain them is really important. Finally, use links and headers to make the steps clear and easy to navigate. You really want your icon module to be intuitive so students know exactly what's expected of them and what order to do it in and how to get to each of the parts, right? The more confusing it is, the more frustrated emails you're going to get, the more upset and sort of unbalanced and sort of confused they're going to feel. So you really want them feeling grounded and stable as they're working through these lessons. And using intuitive links and headers to make that clear is really good. All right, so how do I do this? What structure does this module take when I convert it? So I start, instead of an interactive lecture, with a video lecture on what fables are. Now, is there something lost here? Yeah. What once was an active learning situation is now a passive learning situation. However, the pedagogical research says that recording our lectures and putting them online, even if for a face-to-face class, is actually really good for students and improves learning outcomes across the board. Not just if a student had to miss class, but maybe they had something going on in their life and they weren't as engaged that day as they wish they'd been. Now they have access to this video lecture that they can tune back into and kind of reconnect with that content that maybe they just weren't quite present for, right? So a video lecture on what fables are and how they work. Then I'm going to have them engage in a discussion board. Now, I don't know about you, but I have used and misused discussion boards in my pedagogical life. Oftentimes the way that I used them was by giving them a writing prompt, like analyze this video, and then saying write 250 to 300 words, and maybe comment on someone else's post. And this is really using discussion boards more like a writing assignment or like a blog than like a discussion board, right? So it's not really taking advantage of the form at all. It's also really destroying the informality and the conversational feel that a discussion board can have, right? So we want to maintain discussion boards as that informal space, right, where they can chat about the content without feeling like they're going to be, stridently graded for it or have their instructor looking over their shoulder sort of constantly, right? So instead of having this sort of more involved prompt, give students a couple of questions that they might respond to in the course of the discussion post and remind them that this is a conversation, right? Their job is not to, put their own thoughts out into the world unless they're the first one to post, but rather to respond to what their peers are saying in thoughtful and meaningful ways. On top of that, instead of grading sort of as I might have graded those previous discussion posts as, points out of 10 or something like that, grade them either based on completion or more holistically. For example, grade them the way you might grade class participation, where instead of grading each discussion board, you give them a grade every 3 to 4 weeks based on their participation in their discussion boards, right? So that you're sending the message that there's still a standard and that they still have to be sort of thoughtful and engaged, but that you're not sort of looking to see if they've, misplaced a comma or something like that. You want to maintain this as an informal space. And when I do those discussion boards, I'm not just going to have one, right? Remember that in the original lesson plan, students got to break into groups and discuss a story that was familiar to them. So instead of having just one discussion board that all 20 of them participate in, I'm actually going to break it up. I'm going to have a discussion board about Beauty and the Beast, about Finding Nemo, about Frozen, and then a sort of choose your own, right? And what this does is not just give students a sense of being able to engage in the story that interests them, but also does that thing of splitting them into smaller cohorts, right? Instead of interacting with 19 of their peers, they're interacting with 3, 4, 5 of their peers, right? This can make them feel like they're a more critical part of the conversation, right? Instead of sort of hanging on to a conversation among 20 people, they're actually a central part of a conversation among 4 people, right? And that will help them feel more engaged and a more critical part of the community. Then they'll watch the German Christmas commercial, and then I will have them write a more formal reflection, right, about the German Christmas commercial. And this is their chance to really think deeply and try to put their ideas on paper, right? This is practice analyzing, this is practice writing, and a good check-in for me to make sure that they're really getting the content. I'm also going to modify the prompt in an asynchronous module differently than I would in in-person class. The pedagogical research says that giving students a chance to reflect on course content and on their experience of the course, tying it back to their own lives, is really important for them to feel like they're getting the most out of this class. And so instead of just saying, analyze the intended and unintended messages of this video, I will say that, but then add on, and how do you feel? about these messages? What do you think? Do you think that people out in your lives subscribe to this sort of like get your family together at all costs sort of mentality? What do you think about that? So encouraging them to connect this content to their personal lives will really help with their learning over the course of the class. Okay, now you might notice that there could be a lot of instructor grading work here if you decided to make it so, right? Grading and responding to every single written reflection, all the discussion board posts, right? That's a lot. And you don't want to do that. It is not sustainable. And luckily for us, the pedagogical research says that it's not that useful anyway. That by and large, especially with the discussion posts, students don't read the feedback, yeah? Instead, what the research suggests we do is actually something much closer to what we do in the classroom. Whereas, you know, if instead of on a discussion board, students were having a conversation in class, we wouldn't be like individually responding to each of them for everything they said, right? We'd be drawing connections, pointing out which ideas we thought were really astute, pushing back against ideas that didn't seem wholly thought out, you know, getting students to take their thinking a step further. So instead of responding to all of their discussion engagement, instead have a video response that you record of yourself in which you do the work you would normally do in the classroom, right? Say so-and-so made a really good point on this discussion board and it connects to this point that this other person made on their discussion board, and that can lead to this other idea, right? Do that work that you would do in the classroom and do it in video format that students are more likely to watch. Now you could say, they could just not watch the video. Yes, but there's a way around that too. Instead of just posting the video, maybe a couple of days after students stop engaging on the discussion board, make it the first step of the next lesson. Better yet, if your next lesson starts with a video lecture, make it the first 4 minutes of the video lecture or thereabout, right? Make it so that it's the first step of the next day. This will create continuity across the semester for students, and it will also make it pretty hard to avoid watching it, right? So they make sure that they're getting that content. Okay, so that's the general structure for how I would use those guidelines that we talked about to transform a face-to-face discussion-based class into an asynchronous icon module. In the next 2 videos, I'm going to show you how to actually implement this on icon. I'm going to show you 2 different ways for how to make this asynchronous icon module real and all the nuts and bolts of how to do that. All right, so check out those if you're interested. Thanks.